Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and hopefully you've subscribed. We've actually reached our target so far of 100 subscribers, so keep sharing the videos. If you see our posts on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, share them on there or retweet them on there. Let's see if we can get up to 200 subscribers by the end of the year. Now, as we said, we will continue doing these videos for you, and obviously now lockdown restrictions have been reduced, we will be getting out and about more. I know we spent a good week doing them on Hadrian's Wall, and as you saw on Friday, we actually did our first video from the centre of Worcester. Only a short video really. We just finished a walk, our first walk since lockdown began in March, and we thought we'd give you a quick taster of what we can produce in the future. So make sure you subscribe and then you won't miss any. Anyway, on today's video we have decided to have a look at news, and the reason why we're looking at that really is because it's an interesting topic when you start looking at things like newspapers, and in particular the sort of news that people were interested in the past. We're also very lucky living in Worcester, and I always say this, and I'm sure you've all heard me go on about this before. Worcester has seen every chapter in the history of Britain, and in sometimes world history as well. And one of the most remarkable things about Worcester is we do have the longest continuously produced newspaper, and that's the Burroughs Journal, but more on that in a moment. So if you were living in the past, be it in the medieval period, be it in the Anglo-Saxon period, what sort of news was our ancestors interested in? And the simple answer is they were really more interested in what was going around their village or settlement, basically. And where did that news come from? Did they sit there and buy a newspaper and read it in their home? The simple answer is they didn't need it. Most news going right back in history, right back even into the Roman period, at the Forum for example, would have been the news that was read to you. So you would probably have someone in your village that's probably heard about something that happened last week down the lane, and he would pass the news around. When we get full proper Christianity in Britain, that was really the job of the church. So when you had your church mass, and remember we were all Catholic years ago, part of the service would involve parish notices, so you would be told the news of what was going on in the area. So you didn't really concern yourself with what was happening outside your vicinity at all. If you were interested about what was going on further afield, maybe a relative of yours had travelled for business purposes out of the settlement, village or town, then he could, if he was educated, send you a letter. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about letters, purely because that would actually make a very interesting topic in its own right for a video. In other words, we can start talking about the penny black and the penny postal system, for example. But news could come from further afield in a letter format. Later on, it was quite common not to have a letter, but also to receive postcards as well. When you look at the Victorian period and beyond, it was quite common, if you wanted to send news about something, to put it in a postcard. And some postcards could be personalised. In other words, you could have your photograph put onto a postcard backing, and that was very popular in the Great War, for example, in the First World War, and also in the Second World War. So I don't know about you, but if you collect old postcards, I know Helen does, especially ones with pictures of Worcester on, they are an interesting read when you've got a letter on the back. It's not saying wish you were here. They're not holiday postcards. They are saying, for example, Bert is feeling much better, for example. That's what letters were. They were postcards more than proper letters wrapped in an envelope, for example. So people, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, were more interested about their locality, and it was usually the man of the church or a government or so-called local official that said the news. You could also have proclamations telling you what's going on in the country. This is actually a proclamation, and you can see how bad they are with spelling, but what you have to remember, they haven't invented the dictionary. This is from the 17th century, and this is a proclamation saying Charles is now king of this country, and that's the Charles that later on in 1660 becomes King Charles II. At the Battle of Worcester, obviously he was the man that ended up losing the fight and hiding up an oak tree. So you would have this sort of news, and proclamations were generally read from the town centre or the city centre. In Worcester we have the corn market, and there was a scaffold where proclamations were read out on a regular basis. But most of the time people had the odd letter if they were educated or had educated relations. But then during the English Civil War, so really 1642 to 1651, there is a big jump in information, shall we say. And there are lots and lots and lots, and I mean lots here, of pamphlets. And there are pamphlets thrown everywhere during the time of the Civil War. This is actually a pamphlet which consists of letters, 3 letters from Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, and this would have gone round, and you could flick through here and hear what they're saying and what they're talking about. There are lots of these. If you look at the Battle of Powick, or the skirmish at Powick, fought on the 23rd of September 1642, there are lots. And it is funny because the Battle of Powick in the Parliament pamphlet says it was an outright victory to the Parliament cause, and then if you look at the Royalist ones, they also say it was an outright win and Parliament was set to flight basically into a rout at the Battle of Powick. So these are really propaganda leaflets. You couldn't really trust the information in them. I always say this is like fake news in modern times. Always take the pamphlets in the 17th century with a pinch of salt. But then you get the Glorious Revolution in the history of Britain, and also by that period, late 17th, early 18th century, you have more and more people becoming literate. So there's more people being able to read and write. As I said in a previous video, we often used to think people in the Civil War, for example, couldn't read or write, whereas we now think there was more people that could read or write, hence why there were so many pamphlets being thrown around in the period of the Civil War. But as I said, when you get to the Glorious Revolution, the late 17th century, you start finding more official news coming out, and they came usually in what was called a news sheet or a broadsheet, and it was usually a sheet of paper printed on both sides, and it gave in a way the so-called official news. And we say that loosely as well because there were some of these news sheets that were of one political party, for example, and there was some that was heavy in another political party or a different religion, for example. So this is a copy of one from 1683, from June the 25th, 1683, and there's all sorts of news in there, including official letters that have, in a way, sort of leaked out into the into the public eye, very much like letters and things like that leaks out into newspapers today. We're quite fortunate, as I said, because Worcester has the world record, really, of holding the longest running newspaper in history. And it is what is often referred to today by its official title as the Burroughs Journal. However, that started life in 1694 or 1690, they say, as the Worcester Postman. And we have a replica Worcester Postman there. Once again, you would expect, just like the news from the priest, this would be full of local news. Well, interestingly, by this period in time, by the late 17th century, people were wanting to know what was going on the other side of the hill, for example, the other side, the Malvern Hills. And this has a lot of information in it, the Worcester Postman, that has no links in Worcester at all. There's talk in here about hail the size of cannonballs hitting sheep, for example, and killing them. Not actually in Britain, interestingly. This is happening in other parts of Europe, in places like Spain, for example. But they were relatively cheap things. And as I said, by the late 17th century into the 18th century, more and more people could read. So more and more people were picking these things up. It's sad, I always think, that the earliest copy that exists of the Worcester Postman is 1714, unfortunately. So even though we know it started way back in the 1690s, sadly the earliest copy that they own, the Burroughs own, is actually from the 18th century, 1714. But then you eventually get the newspapers that we would recognise. So when you get to the true 18th century, you get the true newspapers that we see and still have today. Here we have an example of one from 1785. So it's a mixture of things. You have what's going on in the theatres, for example, wars overseas. You even get stock exchange information as well, which I find absolutely fantastic. And then the odd news story, a bit about hangings, that sort of thing. Things that people want, the sensational news that we often get in newspaper headlines in tabloids today. And this costs 2.5 pennies, or twopence halfpenny, as it was often referred to at the time. These are replicas, by the way, which allows us to handle them and throw them about, as we often do. This is the newspaper, The Times, which has official news, as it was said at the time. And this is from June the 22nd, 1815. And this copy actually advertises or has a true report of the Battle of Waterloo. And if you think about when that was fought, by the 22nd of June, it had reached Britain and was becoming front page news. We have other newspapers that we use. We've got one here from 1900, another replica newspaper that we have. So this is 1900, as you can see, starting to look very much like the newspapers do today. Same very thin paper, but so-called official news, no longer like the scandalous news sheets or broadsheets or even the pamphlets that came out during the Civil War. And obviously we do like a good headline. This is from 1914, and as this one says, Great Britain at war with Germany. And obviously we get a lot of these sort of things. In the Burroughs Journal, which was still going during the Great War, obviously, still going today, you also had quite often what was called an illustrated supplement. And if you go to places like the Hive in Worcester, you can actually look at those. In other words, the newspapers were full of writing, but if you wanted the pictures to illustrate what the write-ups were, you had to actually go to a separate book that you had to purchase, which had the pictures in, basically. And they're really good if you're doing your family tree. Some families don't have photographs of their ancestors killed in the First World War, but interestingly, especially in the Burroughs Journal, inside the illustrated supplement you will find little pen pictures, tiny little pictures about the size of a passport photo, showing ancestors that fought and died in the Great War. This is very relevant at the moment because obviously 80 years ago we were involved in the Battle of Britain, and this is from August. And I do like how they in a way celebrate the losses, the German losses in the war or in the Battle of Britain, by linking it up with things like cricket, for example. You often see adverts or shall we say headlines saying 170 and not out, for example, but this one is 144 down out of 1,000. So this is really relevant at the moment. This is 80 years ago during the Battle of Britain. But news evolved, news changed. Eventually people got a little fed up with buying a newspaper. Not everyone did. And luckily there was new forms of obtaining the news, and obviously that usually came over the wireless. I've got a little picture of one here. I do own a wireless, but that's locked away at the moment. So that's a little picture of a wireless, and that gave news, especially news from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And then by the 1950s, we suddenly start watching the television. Yes, the television was around pre-1950s, but during the war, television just disappeared. So by the 1950s, people were buying the television and hearing official news on there. Nowadays, however, you can either open up your laptop, there we go, and you can get news almost instantly on your email stream as such. But now, even more, and this happens to me on a regular basis, the phone constantly beeps, you take a look, and you get the latest news, very up-to-date news. So I find it interesting that years ago, our relatives, our ancestors, not too busy about what was happening in the outside world. They would wait to hear what was going on in their surroundings on a Sunday or during one of the many services that people had to attend in the Middle Ages. And then eventually, when literacy levels rose and the free press came out after the Glorious Revolution, the newspaper became the norm until the wireless and modern technology like the phone took over. I even know people, believe it or not, that gets their news on their phone as well. Very modern times we live in. Latest news, almost instant. Anyway, on that note, let us know maybe what sort of newspapers that you use, or do you just look at newspapers online now? Be interesting to find out what your thoughts is. Anyway, on that note, stay safe, enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.